Welcome, everyone. We'll get started now. Thank you for joining us from your living room, office, or whatever corner of the globe you're sheltering in today. I am Kate Wahl, Editor-in-Chief at Stanford University Press and Acquisitions Editor for our list in Middle East Studies. I am joined today by series editors and authors published in our long-standing book series, Stanford Studies in Middle Eastern and Islamic Societies and Cultures. I look forward to a broad-ranging conversation with these panelists and with all of you about the state of the field and publishing in Middle East Studies. I launched Stanford's Middle East Studies list in 2004, shortly thereafter established, with Joel Beinin, this cornerstone series for our program. Laleh Khalili joined us first on the series editorial board, and then in 2018 became our first book, published in 2006, was quite fittingly Joel Beinin and Rebecca Stein's edited volume, The Struggle for Sovereignty, Palestine and Israel. And this month, I put our 50th series title into production, and Stanford Press has released more than 160 titles across our list. Over the years, since the start of the series, much has changed, of course, in research interests, in the academy, in university press publishing, and in the world at large. And we work to anticipate and respond to these changes in building a vibrant book list. Recent global events, notable pandemic, and within the region, a re-entrenchment of repressive regimes now present unique challenges to doing research on and in the Middle East. And as we work in a field with such broad interests, geographic range, and wide constituency of researchers, writers, and readers, it's worth considering how scholarship might vary across a global pool of authors and how to encourage and recognize a diversity of voices. It is these themes, among others, that we might discuss today. And I hope you all will also join us in discussion. There's a Q&A option in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. Please submit your questions, and I will bring them to the panelists over the course of the next hour. I will also note that this event is being recorded and will be made available online for viewing. I'm pleased to introduce today's panelists. Joel Beinin is the Donald J. McLaughlin Professor of History Emeritus at Stanford University. He has written or edited 11 books, most recently Workers and Thieves, Labor Movements and Popular Uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt, published by Stanford Press in 2015. He is co-editor with Bassam Haddad and Shireen Saikali of the forthcoming volume, A Critical Political Economy of the Middle East and North Africa, publishing in early 2021, also from Stanford. Laleh Khalili is Professor of International Politics at Queen Mary University of London. She has published, including Time in the Shadows, Confinement and Counterinsurgency, published by Stanford in 2013, and the just released Sinews of War and Trade, Shipping and Capitalism in the Arabian Peninsula, published by Verso. Nahid Siamdoust is a postdoctoral fellow and lecturer at Yale University's Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies, and in the new academic year, she will be research associate and visiting lecturer in women's studies and anthropology of religion at Harvard University. She is the author of Soundtrack of the Revolution, The Politics of Music in Iran, published by Stanford in 2017. And Darryl Li is Assistant Professor of Anthropology and lecturer in law at the University of Chicago. He is the author of The Universal Enemy, Jihad, Empire, and the Challenge of Solidarity, published by Stanford in 2019. And without further ado, I turn things over to Joel and to our panelists to begin our discussion.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you also to Stephanie Adams and Kendra Schneider for organizing and doing the tech work for this event. As Kate mentioned, the series was launched in 2006. Then, and perhaps for a decade before or more, cultural history and cultural studies were the dominant mode of inquiry in Middle Eastern studies. And the series from its beginning has had some strong representation in this area. Our second book was by Jessica Winiger, Creative Reckonings, The Politics of Art and Culture in Contemporary Egypt. The recent titles include Nahid's book, which I'll let her talk about and more broadly about this topic, so I won't say much more. And the most recent title, Tamir Sorek's The Optimist, A Social Biography of Tawfiq Zayad, which I just received in the mail the other day. Since the financial crash of 2000, political economy has experienced a comeback. And the series and Stanford University Press more broadly, have been major contributors to the revival of political economy in Middle East studies. Some of the very first books that the press published on the Middle East were in this mode before there was even a series. So, for example, Maya Rosenfeld's Confronting the Occupation, Work, Education, and Political Activism of Palestinian Families in a Refugee Camp. The series also featured work in political economy before the 2008 crash. Bob Vitalis's America's Kingdom, Myth-Making on the Saudi Oil Frontier. And Bob has a new book out, not in the series, Oilcraft, but continues this line of inquiry. Also, Samar Suleiman, The Autumn of Dictatorship, Fiscal Crisis and Political Change in Egypt under Mubarak. More recently, Hisham Safiuddin, Banking on the State, The Financial Foundations of Lebanon in 2019, and Amr Adli, Cleft Capitalism, The Social Origins of Failed Market Making in Egypt, which came out only a few months ago. Kate already mentioned the book that Bassam Haddad, Shireen Saikali, and I are co-editing on political economy. So the series continues to be very strong in this arena, which was one of our initial hopes for its agenda. Another area of study which is featured in the series is what we might call modes of governance and repression. Unsurprisingly, many, though not all, the titles in this rubric are geographically situated in Israel-Palestine. Most markedly, Ariella Azulai and Adi Ophir, The One-State Condition, Occupation and Democracy in Israel-Palestine. Shira Robinson, Citizen Strangers, Palestinians and the Birth of Israel's Liberal Settler State, not outside the Israel-Palestine ambit, just to spread the goods. Elif Babul, Bureaucratic Intimacies, Translating Human Rights in Turkey in 2017. Another important book in this mode that is not in the series, but which has been a favorite of my students, is Laleh Khalili's Time in the Shadows, which Kate mentioned in her introduction. And perhaps Laleh will want to say something specific about this particular mode of inquiry, since she already also has a brand new book of this mode. Also published work in what we can call Islamic studies, but needless to say, in a very different mode than classical Orientalism. Among the recent titles are Darryl Li's The Universal Enemy, Jihad Empire and the Challenge of Solidarity. Kate mentioned that in the introduction, and since Darryl is with us, he may want to say something about this, but other recent titles in this mode include Pascal Meneret, Graveyard of Clerics, Everyday Activism in Saudi Arabia, which came out this month, and Tariq Bakoni, Hamas Contained, The Rise and Pacification of Palestinian Resistance in 2018. The series has also featured what I reluctantly call Arab Spring studies, because that is a very problematic term. The implication that there was little mobilization and contestation in the region, despite the persistence of autocracy, refuted by a volume that Frédéric Virel and I co-edited, Social Movements, Mobilization, and Contestation in the Middle East and North Africa. The book came out in 2011 and was reissued in 2013 precisely in order to demonstrate the continuity between some of the movements of the 2000s and the uprisings of 2011, and in the case of Syria, also the discontinuity. Asaf Bayat's Revolution Without Revolutionaries, Making Sense of the Arab Spring in 2017, and Gilbert Ashkar's Morbid Symptoms, Relapse in the Arab Uprising of 2016 are other notable books in this mode. And we have several books in the pipeline that continue this field inquiry. If people want to ask about them, I'm sure that Kate will tell you what's on deck. The series has not been as active in gender studies as it might have been. We do have a few notable titles. Laura Beer, Revolutionary Womanhood, Feminisms, Modernity, and the State in Nasser's Egypt, but not as much as we should have and would like to have. We also haven't given sufficient attention to studies of popular music and cultures of resistance. So of course, Nahid's soundtrack of the revolution falls under that rubric, and I hope she'll say something about that and encourage people to submit things of that sort. In a very different way, Tamir Sorek's The Biography of Tawfiq Zayad is in this mode. Many of Zayad's poems, as well as those of Mahmoud Darwish and other well-known Palestinian poets, have been rendered into music by Marcel Khalifa, and among the major performers are Reem Albana, the late Reem Albana, and Amal Mur'us, and others. I'm not aware of any book in any language about all of this, and so I'd like to invite one. There are other phenomena of a similar sort around the region. Elliot Kola, for example, has been writing about Egyptian movement poetry, and we may have something on that topic from him in the not too distant future. I'll conclude by saying something about the geographical shift that has occurred since the series began. The series began, as Kate mentioned, with a book on Israel-Palestine, and it is very strong, has always been very strong in the region, and the Middle East list of the press more broadly is very strong on Israel-Palestine. The second most popular country, both for the series and for the press, is Egypt. But now we have a problem with Egypt. It's basically impossible to do any kind of research on Egypt that requires field research, and even using libraries in Egypt for foreigners has become impossible. I, not too long ago, participated in a session with graduate students in the social sciences at Stanford and told them flat out, no, you will not go to Egypt to do your field work. Fortunately or unfortunately, a new region of importance has emerged, which is well represented in the series, and that's Saudi Arabia and the Gulf. And the reason for this is somewhat obvious. It's not only that we can't go to Egypt anymore, it's that this region, the Gulf and Saudi Arabia at its center, have become the new center of gravity of the Arab world, both in terms of in terms of the cultural weight of a particular versions of Islam, and in terms of their intervening as a counter-revolutionary force throughout the region. That's especially Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. So we have lots of books on Saudi Arabia and the Gulf, and there should be many more. Thanks very much.
Okay, may I go ahead? Yeah, I'm going to try to keep this to about 7 minutes. Please stop me if I go over. I first wanted to start out by saying how wonderful it's been working with Kate Wahl as an editor at Stanford University Press, and the professionalism and the thoroughness that she brings to the game is wonderful for any author. And I also want to thank Joel and Laleh for including my book in their excellent series, which gives the Middle East Studies series at Stanford a sort of cohesiveness of trajectory. So in the next few minutes, I'd like to address the following: where I see Middle East studies and studies of Iran in particular heading in general at the moment, where I see lacunae that I hope will be filled by oncoming and future works, especially also in light of recent historic developments, including the pandemic, massive immigration projects the world over, and the Black Lives Matter movement. And I'll try to speak a little more specifically about cultural and media studies within Middle East studies. So first, about Middle East studies and Iran studies trajectories. In the last years, I think we've seen a real move towards studies of materiality, infrastructures, garbage, electricity, oftentimes studied within the context of neo-imperialism and neoliberalism, such as Laleh's own recent work, and more transnational studies such as Darryl's. And these have been highly illuminating, whether in helping us understand the occupation of Palestine or the kinds of human costs that undergird these policies, or shifting our lens on certain tropes that have become so ingrained, such as the inhumane exceptionality of ISIS, for example. And we've seen great volumes on authoritarianism and political economy, such as the ones that Joel has co-edited. And I think also growth and security studies. So it's been encouraging to see a slowly sort of, the growth of these kinds of works, but it's also been encouraging to see a slowly growing trickle of works on culture. And I know Joel mentioned that, when they took over and started the series in the mid-2000s, cultural history is how the Middle East was approached, but I don't think it was done in a very comprehensive way. It was always done as a sort of niche subject that didn't necessarily apply to our larger understandings of politics and economy and so on. And this is something that I'll talk about a little more. But, we've had in the series at Stanford, there's perhaps not in the series per se, but within Middle East studies, new works on poetry, for example, one on by Niloufar Houri on Iran and another on Iraq by Kevin Jones, and media studies such as Narges Bajorli's book, and other innovative work taking seriously Middle Eastern sounds. For example, Zayad Fahmi's work where he articulates notions of modernity in contemporary Egypt through a study of its urban soundscape. And scholars like Walter Armbrust, who was my own dissertation supervisor at Oxford and is really a pioneer within Middle East studies, to have argued for us to take mass media and new media in their broader sense and non-technologically deterministic sense as seriously as registers such as economy or history. And I think his own most recent work attests to this kind of work, Martyrs and Tricksters, which is an ethnography of Egypt's 2011 uprising. And within it, he thoroughly interweaves considerations of mass and new media into discussions about the political and social processes that unfolded in Egypt following the revolution. And here I'm going to sort of start talking a little bit about the lacunae dicey, even before 2020, which has been a historic game changer and has to shift our focus in contingent ways. But from my purview as someone who works on culture and media, I still don't see enough works on popular culture and media in the Middle East. And this is something that Joel also sort of mentioned in his introduction, and less so even on Iran, where culture and media are taken as, not works that are sort of comprehensive in taking culture and media as serious registers that have explanatory power for the kinds of political, social, and economic processes that we see. At least as far as Iran is concerned, I think some of this gap has to do with the difficulties of doing research. I think it's safe to say that most people who have published original academic work on Iran with an ethnographic research component in the country have done so when they were fairly off the radar and hadn't yet completed their dissertations, for example, because the Iranian government has become attuned and sensitive to academic work, scaring away researchers with any kind of public recognition. So as soon as somebody has already published something on Iran, they are worried about going back to the country. But I think especially in our hypermediated world with massive global disinformation campaigns on all sides, it should be possible to do some of this work without on-the-ground research, but with certain shortcomings in the works. And I'm a firm believer in writing from the site of study. But considering, for example, to name just one example, the immensity of Iran's state television and the impact of television serials on public conversation and mediations on certain views and values within the Iranian context, it is really mind-boggling that we have at best a handful of articles and a monograph on the subject. And I could list a number of other incredibly important subject areas that remain completely uncovered. As far as medias are concerned, there's also a disciplinary issue. There's some, not but some good studies on new media and politics in Iran and the wider Middle East, such as the impact of Twitter on political conversation in the given sites, or the significance of Instagram in mediating political sentiment, but they're often from very quantitative internet or communication studies situated scholars whose articles don't have the kind of narrative or explanatory power that studies within the humanities would. So I think we need to see more people from within the humanities and the more humanistic social sciences to collaborate with people working within these quantitative methods to tell us in a more comprehensive way why, for example, or what studies of TikTok, for example, tell us about youth coming of age in these countries, about the human, political, cultural, and social processes that we see on these sites, and the ways in which these media apps really rework forms of expression that have further across cultural mediation in these societies. The same applies, of course, to studies on popular culture and music, where those studies need to be dislodged, I think still, and there are a number of really good works, but I think still to this day, we can say that those studies need to be dislodged from their disciplinary niches within, for example, ethnomusicology, and brought to bear in more encompassing ways in the study of the Middle East. And that's something that I try to do in my own work, and there are other great works that do this, but I just think there aren't enough studies that still bring those cultural studies out into the wider field. One last point on this, more thoroughly interwoven with other studies, I think a gendered lens, and this is something that Joel also mentioned, needs to be more comprehensively included in works on all kinds of things. And this is something that my first book, Soundtrack of the Revolution, is actually guilty of, and I can talk more about this if anyone is interested. And lastly, just a few words about the changes brought on by the historic processes that we've undergone in 2020. Just like the pandemic has laid bare the societal and economic and political cleavages that exist in the US, where I am situated, they've done the same for a place like Iran. Now we need to re-examine what we've researched and understood so far. For example, Iran is a country with a strong social welfare system. And the test light that the pandemic has exposed, who's benefited, who's been left behind, and what does this tell us? And in Iran's case, with the heavy involvement of the Revolutionary Guards, for example, in the economy, and increasingly more within the field of culture production, whether it's them creating cool rap songs that pretend to be independent and whatnot, we really need to have greater discussions about what the pandemic has really shown us further about this important force and others, because I feel like the pandemic has been really a great sort of, opener of sorts to shine light on areas that were understood but hidden and not necessarily very easily measurable, but now have become more exposed. And no discussion of certain countries in the Middle East, of course, including Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt, can be done without a consideration of the role of US imperialist policies and machinations in the region, its sanctions, and its blanket approvals and monetary and political support of certain forms of racism and discrimination and oppression. The very last point I'd like to add is that I think we also need more comprehensive work and research on environmental and water studies that weave and social narrative with these powerful developments in mind. And I think I'll give it a break there.
Thanks so much. I just wanted to echo what all the other folks have said so far. Thanks to everyone for logging into this conversation. And it's not just an honor, it's been a true pleasure to have had the opportunity to work with Kate and with the whole team at Stanford University Press, really from the beginning, from conceptualizing the project all the way through the production process. I've always been very comfortable and heartened by the professionalism and care with which you all have approached the creation of books as actual sort of like artifacts of scholarly production, right? So often we think about ideas and arguments that are kind of put out into the ether, whether it's through journal articles or Facebook posts or whatever, but there's something about the book as an object, right, that has the promise of immersing you into a reading experience from start. Yeah, thanks, Laleh. From start to finish, that I really came to appreciate, because I think part of what happens when you enter graduate study is that books become disenchanted, right? The first thing you do often is to learn how to breaks, right? Get their argument, look at the acknowledgements, look at the index, and because you have to absorb huge amounts of information. So it's odd that it takes all of these years to come back to the pleasure of rediscovering the book as an object and sort of participating in the creation of one. So I just really wanted to, put on record my gratitude for making that process as pleasurable as possible. I just wanted to, echo a few points that have been made about sort of what I think the list is doing and possible further directions. For me, one of the really interesting questions has been sort of, what does it mean to have a list that is ostensibly about area studies, right? And the area or the region as a kind of epistemological category. Because it's odd that this is a list that bills itself as a list about Middle Eastern and Islamic societies, right? When we know, of course, that the vast majority of Muslims throughout the world don't live in the Middle East. And so for me, the experience of doing trans-regional work. So for those who don't know, my book is about the sort of migration of transnational jihad fighters to Bosnia-Herzegovina in the Balkans in the 1990s. So, I could have, like tried to publish this with a press that specializes in the Balkans or Eastern Europe, right? And there are those that different works. But for me, it was really never a question to work with SUP and to work with this series, because I never felt that it was bounded by a kind of area studies framework, right? Even though it is an area sort of press, there is a kind of capaciousness with thinking about and across and in the connections and spaces between regions that I thought was heartening, right? And that I felt was sort of welcoming about the project. There are titles that Stanford has put out that are also kind of in this spirit, right? So I'm thinking, for example, of Laleh John's work on pilgrims from Central Asia, and also Mona Kia's new work, Persian Itself, right, which is a fantastic study of sort of early modern or pre-modern Persian identity in the wider sort of Indian Ocean or subcontinental world. So I think that's one thing, which is sort of, what does it mean to think in, across, and from a region, and to do so in a way that helps us decenter a lot of our assumptions and categories, right, about kind of the West as both the center and also the audience for a lot of knowledge production. Without any kind of over-promising about producing sort of radically new sort of ways of looking in the world, I still felt that, for me, doing this work across kind of the Arab region and the Balkans, and also as an Asian American scholar, and thinking about these sort of categories that all sort of get mixed and remixed in various ways, I found working with Stanford just a really productive kind of space for expanding on some of those debates. The other point, and this is sort of where, again, back to the title of the series, right, Middle Eastern and Islamic, as Joey said, the series is not invested in kind of classical vision of Islamic studies, which is heavily invested in kind of texts, philology, especially older texts. And, it's this whole category of what we mean by Islamic society, I think, is one that is sort of an open one, right, and generates sort of ongoing debate. And especially because of the topic of the book that I was working on, jihad, there's this incredible sort of public pressure that treats the kind of doctrinal text as the source of threat, right, that radiates violence. So you read a medieval text and then a guy goes and, sets off a bomb somewhere. So I think everyone working on the region, is sort of aware of and conditioned by the, frankly, just racist sort of public discourse about sort of Islam and Muslims. But I think in my experience with the book and with the press, there's this challenge of how do we talk about Islam in a way that takes the category seriously without kind of forcing these sorts of tropes, right? So in my particular case, one of the ways of doing it was by thinking with transregionalism and universalism, and to think about Islam as, a sort of an ocean of practices and repertoires that allow folks from very different places and very different cultures and very different perspectives to find ways of connecting and arguing with each other, right? So it was an attempt to take seriously a lot of the older histories and textual things, but to sort of show how they get sort of worked out in a contemporary context, including a context of political violence that is so often a lot of these both assumptions and also apologia in thinking about sort of contemporary jihad practices. And all of that connects to a third point, which is, I think, a consistent theme in the series that everyone is sort of hinted at, but I think it's worth drawing attention to, which is that I think the press has shown frankly, a brave commitment to doing work that is politically relevant, right? Without kind of over promising sort of the political, I'm not one of these people who thinks that like scholarly production is itself kind of a revolutionary act, but I think that, again, because of the enormous pressures that exist around these debates, right, there are a lot of incentives to kind of keep your head down right? And avoid certain kinds of topics or avoid writing about them in certain kinds of ways. And I think the press and the series in particular, especially in the engagement work around Israel, Palestine, but also around other things, has really shown that it wants to be relevant, that it's not shying away from these things, that this is, you know, not only intellectually productive, but also, I hope, lucrative, or at least not a sort of total, you know, loser in terms of readership, because there are people out there who, you know, who want this kind of engagement, who want to read these things, who want these kinds of alternative perspectives. And I think that's another enormously valuable service that the press has provided, and I'm sure will continue to provide. It's so funny, just one other random note, at the beginning of the conversation, I think, Kate, you mentioned that the series dates to 2004, right? Which is the year that I entered graduate school. But for some strange reason, I always had it in my mind at Stanford Press was the place where this work was being done, right? Like, I actually thought the series was much older than it was. There is still this like sense of this lingering set of commitments to publishing. And, you know, the fact that it's not quite as old as I thought is also a reminder that that these efforts are contingent, and they take work, and they involve some risks of failure, risks of other things, and they you know, we all have to sort of contribute to continuing them and finding new ways of making them relevant and expanding them as time goes on, and sort of, as Nahid mentioned, as new crises emerge.
Hello. Thank you so much, Nahid and Darryl and Joel, of course, for your wonderful talks. And I want to also start by acknowledging Kate, because I started working with Kate as an author first, later as a member of the editorial board, and now as a co-editor. And at every stage, I am constantly awed by her eyes, her ear, her judgment, and her diplomacy and her professionalism. I think that it has been an incredible pleasure to work with you, Kate, and you, Joel, and learning from both of you. So I have to start with that, because I think it's quite important to acknowledge this labor. I also want to thank Stephanie and Kendra, who are with Stanford University Press and who've organized the talk today very efficiently, and and they're brilliant, and it's lovely to work with them also, as they've been working behind the scenes. I'm incredibly glad that you guys, Joel, Nahid, and Darryl, talked about the kinds of things that you did, because it picks up on two kinds of things that I wanted to, two broader subjects that I really wanted to discuss today. One is about what I'm excited about in studies of the Middle East, but beyond the Middle East. And the second is the concerns that I see coming, and I sort of want to put them out there, perhaps first and foremost in order to allay my own anxieties. It's always better to voice your anxieties, but also because I think that those are things that we need to think about as we go forward, both as publishers of books, but also as authors and researchers of them. So what am I most excited about nowadays? One is something that actually both Darryl and Nahid mentioned, and that's the transnationalism, the movement of things across. Now, in Nahid's case, this is culture and media. In Darryl's case, it is people and ideas. And that idea of the transnational Middle East, the Middle East that is located in a world and that is not hermetically sealed, that it's not its own area in the ways in which area studies was understood even 10 or 15 years ago, is one of the most exciting things that is happening right now in the world. In a way, actually, the catastrophes of this year, both the police violence in the US that has led to the not catastrophic, in fact, quite exciting Black Lives Matters movement, but also the catastrophe of pandemic, have shown the intimacy of the connections across borders. And so that transnationalism is something that I think is going to be really interesting, and the effects that it's going to have and echoes that we're going to hear of it in the work that is going to come out is going to be particularly relevant to our series. Now, the two specific areas I wanted to mention, I want to overlap a lot with what Nahid and Darryl said, but inevitably it's going to, is one is that I think the nationalism of infrastructure and environmental studies is absolutely something that we really would love to see a lot more of in the studies of the Middle East. And now I'm seeing a lot more of that. We had in the last couple of years, Sophia Stamatopoulos-Robbins' book on waste in Palestine, in Israel-Palestine. And I think that that discussion of infrastructure and environment was very attuned to the kinds of transnational politics and geopolitics that underlay the production of waste and and dealing with it there. But there's a lot more kinds of work coming out that is just really exciting. Politics around the usage of water, of air pollution, of the ways in which environmental activism is arriving and emerging in sort of grassroots ways in all sorts of places, which I think is very exciting. And actually exciting and kind of depressing. So I don't know if anybody's been paying attention, for example, to the new Nile Dam that is being built in Ethiopia. And a lot of people, the only way that they want to talk about that is as a kind of a geopolitical story. But I actually think that thinking about it as a kind of an environmental story, as a weird repetition of the Great Aswan Dam and the echoes of that, as a kind of a nationalist project, which ended up being quite devastating both to the Nubians that populated that part of Egypt, but also to the environment more broadly, is something that is that we really need to be more attentive to. And I think kind of a Middle East studies that pays attention to those kinds of transnational environmental and infrastructural projects, those things often overlap, is really exciting to me. Now, I am partial to this because my own work is about maritime, my most recent work is about maritime infrastructures, but I think it is something that I also have taught about, and the more I read about it, the more I find that I'm a student in that field and that there's a lot more work to be done, and it's very exciting and new. The second area, which I think that Nahid touched on and Darryl touched on in a different way, is the ways in which ideas about race and racialization are spreading and being adapted and being transformed in very particular ways and in very specific and contextualized sorts of ways, but in ways that also show the interconnections, both material and discursive, between forms of racialized oppression, the violence of the state, the forms of policing, the forms of the carceral forms, the legal forms even that are being created in order to repress racialized populations. And a lot of this stuff is of course out of a long history of the study of race and racism in the US. But I do think that there's also, I'm seeing a lot of PhD students that are launching new projects working on the Middle East, doing some really interesting work that tries to think about these concepts not as modular wholly, not as entirely imported from, let's say, the US or the UK or from the colonial masters, but really genuinely as developed, reinforced, and as invested in particular locales in the middle. Again, for example, the ways in which Nubians are treated in Egypt would be one, but all the various peripheral populations of Iran and the racialization of these various populations, and the xenophobia that often comes with migrant populations, because of course we've got huge amounts of migration internally to the Middle East, for example, of Somalis in Yemen, or actually also now Yemenis in Somalia. Those kinds of, those elements of transforming difference into forms of violence, power, and disciplinary mechanisms is something that it's a very grim subject, but I think there's some really interesting and probably quite paradigm shifting works that are hopefully emerging around that subject. Now, what are my concerns? I have two. I mean, I've got loads, but I'm just an anxious person, so I have loads of concerns and I worry about things all the time, but I have two at the moment and I want to quickly wrap that up. My first concern is about COVID, because on the one hand, as Nahid said, COVID absolutely shows the fissures, but also the interconnections of global politics. It shows, in my own work, I've seen the way, in my own most recent research, I've seen the way that, for example, maritime transport ends up being a major conduit, whether on cruise ships or even on cargo ships, ends up being a major conduit of the pandemic throughout the world. And so I think that in a way that this concern, on the one hand, provides a scholarly opening, but it also provides something of a concern, because I think that along with COVID comes new forms of racialization, along with COVID comes new restrictions on movement, along with COVID comes new forms of xenophobia. And so I think that that is one of my concerns, and I worry that it will be used as ways of limiting research, whether a researcher is from this or arriving somewhere to study as both an insider or an outsider. The second concern that I have is one that I think perhaps those of us who are much more familiar with it, the sort of rise of violent, autocratic, incredibly violent regimes that have absolutely no compunctions about punishing peoples and increasingly punishing those who used to be among protected categories, people of the, say, middle classes or women in some instances, or foreigners. And so I think that concern is, to me, a major concern, also because of the way, again, the transnationalism that I think in some ways makes for a very interesting milieu of study, also makes for a very worrying characteristic, because much in the same way that there was a period in which there was a left international, third worldism, we see a fascist international emerging. And maybe I'm exaggerating by calling it fascist, but there's certainly a right-wing international emerging where tactics and discourses of mobilization are being shared across borders. And I do worry about what effect that might have on our research. And I think it is an area which, precisely because it's such an area of concern, and perhaps precisely because it is going to be very difficult and possibly even dangerous to research, does provide an area in which we can contribute to understanding what's going on. On that note, I really don't want to speak very much longer. I wanted to also invite, I just quickly looked at the list of the attendees. I'm not supposed to do that because it'll distract me, but I looked at the list of the attendees, and where I recognize names, I saw some of the names of people that I have read their works, and I think they are absolutely brilliant. Some of those names are authors in our list. Some are aspiring to be authors in that list. And I just want to say it's really exciting that you're here and that you're listening. And I hope that you feel free to ask any questions you may want to ask of the four of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, all four of you for your wonderful words about the list, I'm humbled by what you said, and about the work that we do, and more generally speaking, in developing books in this list area. I want to echo what Laleh said and encourage everyone who's listening, and please do write in your questions, and we have some time now until the end of the hour to discuss whatever is on your mind and would like to bring to each of us. One thing I suppose is a place to start, we do have a thinking through what everyone was talking about of both areas of emphasis within the list as well as gaps or areas that are emerging within scholarship. And we do have a question asking us as well, how do we explain the various gaps within either the Middle East studies as a field or within our list in general? I wanted to, perhaps we could speak to, and this perhaps more goes to Joel and Laleh as series editors. This is something I think about quite a bit, of what are the responsibilities and challenges of editorial work. Always, I think, to balance strengths, interests. We can't publish in every area. So how do we make those choices, and what are the responsibilities of those choices? What makes in giving the platform authors and how we select and echo where the academy is moving as well.
Joel, do you want to go first, or should I go first? You're on mute. Yeah.
Right. So, especially in the beginning, and for me, still largely, the way books came to the series was through the networks of people that I knew, or the people who I knew someone published a book in the series and said, I have a friend who's working on this, and would you be interested to see this work? And Kate would do the same sort of thing. I don't think that we thought too much about what we aren't doing, because the most important criteria, and I would argue that this is still the case, is that what we do is of a very high standard. I don't think we should make any compromises because there are gaps. I mean, we've all spoken about them, and I'm sure there are others, just for the sake of representation. If there's someone out there who is doing work on one of the areas that we have identified as a gap, either the series or the press's list more broadly, welcome. Send us your work. We'll be very happy to take it seriously. There are, in my case, clear limitations about who I know. I did recruit one book in the series on Turkey, but that was someone from Stanford whose dissertation committee I was on. I don't have a good idea of what's going on in the scholarship around Turkey. Of course, we rely on Laleh to work on Iran, know about Iranian things. We don't know so much about parts of North Africa. And I don't think any press could pull gamut successfully and at a high level of quality.
I mean, I would like to also mention something else. I did a compendium of articles some years ago in 2008, a 4-volume compendium of articles about the Middle East. And while I was doing that, I did this category, which is to enumerate. I like Microsoft Excel for all my sins. So I did this Microsoft Excel of all the articles that had been published up to that point. And it was this huge Excel spreadsheet. And one of the things that became very clear was that on the Middle East, 3 areas, or actually that's not true, 4 areas that are published very extensive, people publish very extensively. One is Israel, Palestine, one is Egypt, one is Iran, and one is Turkey. But interestingly, Iran to be published in journals that cater specifically to Iranians and to Turks rather than more broadly to the Middle East studies. Or at that time, and this was again 2000, the majority of the articles seem to be going in that direction. So I think in part, this is also the gaps, if they're geographic, that might be structural. It might be the habits of publishing, who publishes where, who gets invited to get published there, et cetera, et cetera. I also think that there's something else that, when we were preparing for this meeting, we joked about in the meeting, and that was that there is a particular, although there might not be necessarily a kind of a limit on the kinds of rubrics, which Joel nicely enumerated, and the kinds of things we publish, there's also a kind of an ethos to the series, which is that we don't necessarily go for the kind of mainstream quantitative, experimental, et cetera, political science that is that's already being published elsewhere. Now, I'm saying this, and I can say this because I trained as a political scientist. So, if it's anything, it's self-loathing. But it's also the kind of politics that we sort of like to talk about doesn't necessarily emerge out of a political science area, and is not necessarily, and the kinds of concerns that we have, the kinds of puzzles that we're interested in, my sense is, are not necessarily the kinds of puzzles that necessarily emerge, for example, in a political science area, or perhaps even on the other end of spectrum in some of the kinds of literary cultural studies that have, again, their own kind of body milieu of publication. So some of this is structural, and some of this has to do, again, as Joel said, with the kinds of networks we have. Now, I'm on this side of the pond, I'm on the European side of the pond, and so in a way, what I'm exposed to and the people that I meet are very different than the kinds of people Joel meets. I do go to Mesa, although one wonders whether after COVID such things are going to be possible. But so the kinds of exposures that I have to UK and European Middle East studies shows up a very different body of work with probably lots of overlaps, but also different approaches, because disciplinary social science approaches here tend to be much more humanistic than in the US. And with the exception of possibly anthropology, most don't sort of police their boundaries with the same intensity as they do in the US. And so there's a lot more overlap that I see in the kinds of work people do in the disciplines here. And that might also explain some of the gaps and some of the differences and some of the absences.
We've received a question asking us, could we reframe the series beyond the narrowness of area studies? And perhaps this somewhat what the question is getting to, and Darryl, you spoke to this a bit, and I will admit, I've struggled since the beginning of what to call this list, of whether it really doesn't, I think, conform with traditional area studies in that sense, but for somewhat laziness perhaps, or lack of having a better wording for it. The simplicity of saying Middle East studies is what became easiest to say. How do each of you, as view both, we don't have to necessarily keep this to the series itself, but your own work and that positioning within the various types of disciplinary area studies of the academy, how do we approach our work on this region? And is there utility in the name of Middle East studies?
Darryl, you should speak to this because this is your thing.
I mean, I don't have that much to add to what I said earlier. I think we have to, be honest and grapple with the fact that these regional categories are themselves products of imperial and Cold War geographies. Like, that's undeniable. I think that there is also a benefit to trying to think from other locations and to sort of choose to ground yourself in a certain place and in the conversations that emerge in that place. And I think to the extent that that's a valuable exercise, that potentially overlaps with some version of the area studies project that can be salvaged, but I think only salvaged in a way that is immensely critical of where it's coming from and what it's being used for. So, because I think the issue is, on the one hand, it's undeniable that like area studies is a limiting framework, right? But then the question is exactly the question that was raised here, which is, okay, and so what's the alternative, right? And sometimes that's a really generative question for producing works. But when we're talking about producing fields and lists and categorical organizations, these categories have a certain kind, the area studies categories have a kind of, they have a kind of gravitational pull to them that's a little hard to completely deny. So, I don't know if I have like a good question other than just the obvious one of we continue to struggle against it and think against it. But, that also does reify it to a certain extent. And I think we should be honest about that.
I'm a historian. History occurs in a specific time and in a specific place. But you don't have to think about it as only in that time and that place. So recently I wrote something about Algeria. So if you write about Algeria in the struggle for independence, you have to talk about Frantz Fanon, who of course comes from Martinique, which raises the whole question of the French Empire. And if you think about this Algerian struggle for independence in the broader North African context, well, it's when Eisenhower and the American troops invaded Morocco to start to drive the Nazis out of North Africa. And then 2 weeks later, FDR and Churchill meet with Mohammed V, and FDR sort of promises him independence. And so, okay, now we're in a very broad global struggle that includes not only what's going on in World War II, but also the emergence of the Cold War and how the Cold War is going to deal with the question of decolonization. So again, all of this is focused in this particular story on Algeria, although I had to go to Morocco to get the beginning of the story. And around the Algerian War for Independence, but it's very easy to see how beyond the boundaries of communities as they have been traditionally configured.
I'll just add very quickly that, especially when it comes to cultural and media studies, there's no way of confining the study to a particular geographic region. Obviously, we're talking about, the diasporas, the kinds of production that happen there with media and the internet. You're talking about all kinds of productions that are happening outside of the geographic space of the Middle East. But I think it's, also echoing everybody else, that it's a useful sort of concept to just hold on to be situated somewhere, understanding that this concept is incredibly vast.
And I'm only going to just say one word. I mean, as problematic as, or not one word, but one sentence, as problematic as Middle East studies might be as a concept and as a historical problem, number one, all disciplines are in one way or another enmeshed in that history of imperialism and colonialism, particularly in our part of the world. And number two, writing from a very specific location also means that you often have to speak the languages of that specific location. And I think that that is enormously important for understanding the politics of that place.
As the most on this panel, if I may just point us to a question that I'm seeing in the Q&A about whether the series is open to publishing independent non-English scholars. It says, for example, those former adjuncts who taught for years in elite institutions, but finally left or were forced to leave academia, especially at this particular moment with COVID, where there are hiring freezes all across academia, and the nature of academia might in fact be changing in ways that we can't even foresee. I would like to sort of point to that question in the Q&A.
I'll jump in first on that. And I would said earlier that I think there's a level, as I vet proposals coming in, it is a level of quality and kind of exceptional work that we're looking for. It is not necessarily a pedigree of where the person is situated in their academic career right now. And so certainly every project that we publish goes through the peer review process and is approved by Stanford's faculty editorial board. But who the author is, I think that is, I'll say even just from a practical sense, I don't read a CV first. I read the book proposal first and intentionally leave the CV at the bottom of the pile of what I'm reading so that I take the work on its merit, not based on necessarily who it's coming from or the network that might have recommended the project to begin with. So in a way I would say certainly, of course, but again, everything is subject to that peer review process.
There's also another question about how there's no everyday studies of everyday life. I was actually looking at that question in the Q&A that was saying there's so few studies of everyday life in the series, and I'm like, almost everything I have read in the last 3 years, and I have read all of the manuscripts that I've come across, are studies of everyday life. So I'm not sure I recognize the series in that question.
I think really strong in that suit, actually.
We have had someone ask if we would post a list in here, and we could certainly pull it together, but I would refer everyone to the website. And I think to the, following on Laleh's point of what has come out of late too, we do on the Stanford Press website have all of our Middle East books together, but there is also a link specifically for this series where you can see the books that are coming through and the shift over time of the areas of interest that we've published.
Kate, maybe you would like to say something about some of the forthcoming books that aren't yet on the website?
Yeah, so we are currently pulling together, announced the fall winter books. So that was what will be published between September and February of next year. Those books are now on our website and would be in our Middle East catalog, which is also available there. Right now, what is pulling together all the material that we're going to be publishing in spring, summer next August of 2021. We have Shai Haskani's work, Dear Palestine, A Social History of the 1948 War will be included in that. Brandon Wolf Honeycutt's book, The Paranoid Style in American Diplomacy, Oil and Arab Nationalism in Iraq. Hanan Toukan, The Politics of Art, Dissent and Cultural Diplomacy in Lebanon, Palestine, and Jordan. And finally, Mona El-Gobashi, Bread and Freedom, Egypt's Revolutionary Situation. Some of this, I think, obviously speaks to a lot of the strengths we've already talked to. Some of it's going to start to fill in some of those gaps we've been talking about. 4 books I'm very excited to see come through in the spring of next year.
I think a Mona El-Gobashi book counts as a world historical event.
Well, wonderful. With that, I suppose I will thank, as this hour draws to a close, thank everyone, in particular Joel, Laleh, Darryl, and Nahid for sharing their thoughts and your time today. Also thank everyone who's been watching and participating from far and wide. As I noted at the beginning, this has been recorded, so the video will be made available on the Stanford Press YouTube channel following the event. If you have any other questions, please do feel free to contact me. And particularly if you have questions about a proposal, our guidelines are available on the website, and I'm always easily reached via email if you have questions about my submission requirements for that. I wish you all well. Please stay safe, and I look forward to a day when we can pick up these conversations again in person.
So you don't get away so quickly, Kate, without a word from me. Everybody who I have ever spoken to about Stanford University Press has heard me say that Kate Wahl is my favorite person at Stanford, and it would have been a totally different experience for me without Kate's presence, both her professional excellence, her personal warmth and her intellectual encouragement of the sorts of things that I have always been deeply committed to. So Kate gets total kudos from me.
Okay, one last email. If you want to talk about your project and you would like to talk it out a little bit before you actually contact Kate, please feel free to contact me. You should be able to find me on the Queen Mary website, so you should be able to find my email address. I'm sure the same is true of Joel, but I'm not going to volunteer.
There is a question about whether the
Thank
series
you.
has a particularly modern orientation, or whether works that deal with, you know, sort of older periods will be considered by the series.
It does. It's post-World War II. We've
Yes.
sometimes fudged it a bit, but that's the mandate.
But this list in general does consider periods certainly earlier, kind of purposefully reaching into the earlier modern period as well. So you can see that the list at large has a very broad chronological reach. This series in particular is post-1945.
Great.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.